Good morning. Let me say something that might genuinely surprise you. For decades, the general advice given to seniors has been to slow down, take it easy, and accept decline as simply part of getting older. But some of the most interesting longevity research from the last several years points somewhere different. What if the things that keep people sharp, strong, and independent at 75, 80, even 85 aren't what most people assume, but a handful of daily habits that quietly get abandoned somewhere along the way? After looking closely at the research on aging well, not just surviving, but genuinely thriving past 75, one pattern stands out again and again. The people who age the best tend to share a specific set of behaviors. Not expensive supplements. Behaviors. Researchers at Stanford's Center on Longevity have spent years studying exactly this. Which daily habits are most associated with maintaining independence well into your 80s, and which ones matter more than people realize. One consistent finding across this body of research: people who maintain several specific habits together tended to show meaningfully slower rates of what researchers call functional decline, the kind of decline that often pushes people into assisted living earlier than it needs to. That distinction matters. It's the difference between living life on your own terms and having a lot of those terms decided for you. Before we get into the list, I want to tease something because you might be tempted to skip ahead. The habit that comes in at number 1, the most significant of the 6, is something almost nobody talks about. It has little to do with diet or exercise in the traditional sense, and many physicians don't bring it up at all. Research coming out of institutions like Johns Hopkins and the University of Edinburgh suggests it may be one of the strongest predictors of staying cognitively and physically independent after 75. So stay with me, because that last one is worth hearing in full. Before we dive in, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Drop your age in the comments, 68, 74, 81, wherever you are, and tell me which of these 6 habits you think you already have. I read every comment on this channel, and it shapes what we cover next. Let's count down from 6 to 1, starting with something that sounds almost too simple to matter as much as it does. It is worth pausing on why this particular age range gets treated so differently in the first place. Somewhere around 75, a lot of medical conversation quietly shifts from prevention and optimization towards simply managing what shows up. That shift is understandable, but the research increasingly suggests it happens earlier than it needs to for a great many people. None of the 6 habits we are about to walk through require dramatic life change or a large budget. What they require is consistency and a willingness to treat this decade and the ones after it as still worth actively investing in. Habit 6: drinking water strategically, not just casually. Here's what a lot of people get wrong about hydration after 75. They assume it works the same way it did at 45. It doesn't, quite. As the kidneys age, their filtering efficiency gradually declines, and thirst signals become measurably blunted, meaning it's genuinely possible to be dehydrated without feeling thirsty at all. That's a well-documented pattern in geriatric medicine, described by the National Institute on Aging, among others. Even mild chronic underhydration has been linked in aging research to effects on balance, reaction time, and short-term memory, since the brain itself is roughly 3/4 water and sensitive to even small shifts in hydration. The people who handle this well tend to treat hydration as a habit rather than an afterthought, drinking a glass first thing in the morning before coffee, since the body loses fluid overnight through breathing and normal perspiration. Then a small glass with each meal and one more in the mid-afternoon. When energy dips are often mistaken for tiredness rather than mild dehydration. One detail worth knowing: as we age, the body can have more difficulty retaining sodium, which affects how well plain water is actually absorbed into cells. A small pinch of a quality sea salt or an electrolyte tablet alongside your morning water is a detail some geriatric nutritionists point to for exactly this reason. None of this needs to be complicated. Consistent timing, paired with a little attention to electrolytes, is a small habit with an outsized effect on energy and clarity for a lot of people well past 70. It helps to know what mild dehydration actually feels like in daily life, since it rarely announces itself clearly. Afternoon brain fog, a brief dizzy spell when standing up too quickly. A vague sense of mental sluggishness that gets blamed on age itself rather than on something as simple and fixable as fluid intake. One more practical detail. Caffeinated drinks and water are not interchangeable for this purpose. Coffee and tea can be part of a healthy routine, but they should sit alongside consistent water intake, not substitute for it. Since caffeine has a mild diuretic effect that works against the goal, it is also worth mentioning a common misconception in the other direction. Drinking large amounts of water all at once, rather than steadily through the day, does not confer the same benefit and can actually be harder on aging kidneys to process efficiently. Steady and distributed beats occasional and large. A simple way to track this without much effort. Notice the color of urine over the course of a day. Pale yellow generally indicates good hydration, while consistently darker shades are a useful, low-effort signal that intake needs adjusting, without needing to track exact ounces obsessively. None of this requires tracking apps or complicated routines. A glass by the bed, a glass with each meal, and a little attention to how you feel by mid-afternoon is usually enough to notice whether adjustment is needed. Habit 5. Resistance-based movement at least twice a week. I want to be clear about what this actually means, because it's often misunderstood. This isn't about heavy gym lifting. It's any movement that asks muscles to work against some form of resistance. A resistance band, a light dumbbell, a wall push-up, or even carrying groceries with a bit of intention behind it. This distinction matters more after 75 because of something researchers call anabolic resistance. Aging muscle becomes less responsive to the normal signals that build and maintain it, meaning it takes more deliberate stimulus to hold on to the same muscle a younger body would maintain with less effort. Left unaddressed, this contributes to sarcopenia, the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength with age, which geriatric research consistently associates with higher fall risk and greater difficulty with everyday tasks over time. Encouragingly, research on older adults who begin twice-weekly resistance training tends to show meaningful improvements in leg strength and balance within a matter of weeks. The body remains remarkably responsive to this kind of stimulus even later in life. A practical target: 2 to 3 sessions a week, 20 to 30 minutes each, focused on the larger muscle groups, legs, hips, and back. Resistance bands tend to be ideal here, since they provide progressive resistance without hard impact on the joints. One additional detail worth knowing: having a source of protein within roughly half an hour after a resistance session may help, since the window during which aging muscle most efficiently uses protein for repair tends to be shorter than it was earlier in life. It is worth being specific about what counts, because the bar is lower than most people assume. A resistance band anchored to a doorknob, a few wall push-ups between errands, or standing up from a chair slowly and with control several times in a row are all genuine resistance work, even without any equipment at all. Consistency tends to matter more than intensity here. 2 shorter, genuinely consistent sessions a week reliably outperform one occasional, ambitious one, largely because muscle adaptation in older adults responds better to steady, repeated stimulus than to sporadic effort. For anyone recovering from an injury or managing a chronic condition, it is worth saying clearly that this does not mean pushing through pain. Gentle, controlled resistance work, cleared with a doctor or physical therapist first, is the goal here, not intensity for its own sake. A useful way to think about progress here is not in terms of how much weight or resistance is used, but in terms of everyday tasks becoming noticeably easier over time. Standing up from a low chair without using the armrest, carrying groceries in one trip instead of 2. These are the real-world markers that the research tends to track anyway. It is also worth mentioning balance work specifically alongside resistance training, since the two are closely related in the research on fall prevention. Simple practices like standing on one foot briefly while holding a counter, or walking heel to toe across a room, are low-effort additions that meaningfully complement resistance work. And if starting from very little activity feels intimidating, the research is reassuring on this point specifically. Even modest amounts of resistance work produce measurable benefit compared to none at all. And the gap between doing a little and doing nothing tends to matter more than the gap between a little and a lot. Quick note: if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps. And if you know someone between 70 and 90 who'd benefit from this, sharing it with them today is one of the more useful things you could do with the next 10 seconds. Habit 4. A consistent, purposeful sleep schedule. This one is more layered than simply going to bed earlier. As the body ages, the internal circadian clock tends to shift and weaken somewhat, and melatonin production naturally declines. Both well-documented patterns in sleep research on older adults, described by organizations like the National Sleep Foundation. Deep, slow-wave sleep, the most physically restorative stage during which the body carries out a lot of its repair work, also tends to decrease with age. Disrupted sleep in older adults has been studied in relation to several markers of brain health, which is part of why sleep quality gets more, not less. Important later in life, the people who manage this well tend to protect a few specific habits. Going to bed within roughly the same half-hour window each night, waking at a consistent time, including weekends, and keeping the bedroom on the cooler side, since temperature regulation during sleep becomes somewhat less efficient with age. Many also step away from screens for the hour before bed, not only because of light exposure, but because mental stimulation from a bright screen can measurably delay how quickly the mind settles into sleep, a pattern described in sleep research from several major medical centers. A simple addition some sleep researchers point to: several minutes of slow, deliberate breathing before bed, which engages the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and repair mode, and can make it noticeably easier to settle into deeper sleep. It is also worth naming what tends to quietly undermine good sleep habits in this age group specifically: daytime napping that runs too long or too late in the day, which can make it harder to fall asleep at the usual time and gradually shifts the whole schedule later. A short nap, 20 minutes or so, earlier in the day tends to be far less disruptive than a longer one in the late afternoon. Small adjustments like this one are often enough to restore a sleep schedule that has quietly drifted over months or years. Light exposure earlier in the day plays a role too. A short amount of time outside in natural morning light has been studied for its role in helping reinforce the body's circadian signal, which tends to work alongside, not instead of, the evening habits already mentioned. Alcohol is worth a specific mention here too, since its relationship with sleep quality changes somewhat with age. Even moderate evening alcohol has been associated in sleep research with more fragmented, less restorative sleep in older adults, more so than in younger adults, which is worth factoring into an evening routine. It is worth being patient with this one in particular, since sleep habits that took years to drift rarely reset in a single week. Most people who commit to a consistent schedule for several weeks in a row report noticeable improvement, even if the first few nights of adjustment feel a little unfamiliar. Habit 3. Eating protein in a deliberate, distributed pattern. This is where I see one of the more persistent misconceptions: the idea that you need less protein as you age. The research actually points the other way. Because of that anabolic resistance we mentioned earlier, aging muscle generally needs more dietary protein, not less, to maintain the same amount of muscle a younger body would hold on to more easily, a concept well established in geriatric nutrition research, including guidance from groups like the Prot-Age Study Group. And yet many older adults eat noticeably less protein than their bodies now need, often because appetite naturally decreases with age, and lighter, carbohydrate-heavy foods feel easier to prepare. Research in this area generally supports aiming for a meaningfully higher protein intake per pound of body weight than in your 30s, spread across 3 or more meals rather than concentrated in one, since aging muscle can only make efficient use of so much protein in a single sitting, a practical target that nutrition researchers in this space often suggest. roughly 25 to 35 grams of protein at each main meal, about 4 to 5 ounces of chicken, fish, eggs, Greek yogurt, or legumes. Pairing protein-rich meals with a small source of vitamin C, citrus, bell pepper, a splash of lemon, is worth knowing too, since vitamin C supports collagen production, which works alongside protein to maintain joints and connective tissue, not just muscle. For anyone who has been told for years to watch cholesterol and has therefore avoided eggs specifically, it is worth knowing that current dietary guidance from several major health organizations has moved away from strict limits on dietary cholesterol for most healthy older adults, given how nutritionally complete eggs otherwise are. For those who prefer to eat less meat, plant-based combinations, lentils and rice, or beans and whole grains paired together, can provide a comparably complete amino acid profile and are worth rotating in for both variety and digestive comfort. It is worth noting that thirst and appetite both tend to become less reliable signals with age, which means that waiting to feel hungry before eating enough protein can quietly lead to undereating over time without anyone noticing the gradual shift. Structuring meals around a target rather than around hunger alone tends to work better past a certain age. Digestive comfort is worth a brief mention too, since some older adults find that very high-protein meals feel heavier than expected. Spreading intake across meals, as already discussed, tends to help with this as well, alongside choosing well-tolerated sources and staying adequately hydrated alongside protein-rich meals. A final practical note: this does not mean abandoning foods you genuinely enjoy. It means building meals with a protein source as the anchor, then adding the vegetables, grains, and other foods you already like around it, rather than treating this as a restrictive diet. Habit 2. Daily intentional social engagement. I mentioned earlier that one of the last 2 items on this list would surprise people. This is one of them, because it can sound too soft to be a serious health recommendation. It isn't. The research connecting social connection to longevity in older adults is some of the most consistently replicated in the field. A well-known meta-analysis led by researchers including Julianne Holt-Lundstad, drawing on data from hundreds of thousands of participants, found that chronic social isolation was associated with a mortality risk comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. That comparison is worth sitting with. Loneliness isn't simply an emotional discomfort. In the research, it behaves like a measurable physical health risk, particularly for adults past 75, where it has also been studied in connection with faster cognitive decline. Part of the mechanism appears to be biological. Genuine social interaction, not passive time in the same room as someone, but real engaged conversation, is associated with the release of oxytocin, which in turn is linked to lower cortisol and reduced inflammation markers in several studies. Researchers sometimes describe the brain's social circuitry a bit like a muscle. The neural pathways involved in real conversation, shared laughter, and emotional connection are largely the same ones involved in memory and a stable sense of self, and pathways that go quiet for long stretches do tend to weaken with disuse. The practical target here is simple to state, though it takes intention to keep. At least one genuinely engaged social interaction a day. A real phone call counts. So does a regular walk with a friend, a faith community, a book club, or a standing lunch with a neighbor. Passive presence, the television on in a room with someone, doesn't carry the same benefit in the research. Combining social time with light physical activity, a walk with a friend, a gentle class, gardening alongside a neighbor, appears in some research to have a modestly compounding effect on markers related to brain health, beyond either behavior on its own. For anyone who feels their social circle has genuinely narrowed with age, which is common and not a personal failing, structured options tend to work better than waiting for connection to happen naturally. A recurring class, a faith community, a volunteer shift, or a walking group all provide a built-in reason to show up regularly, which matters more than most people expect. Technology can genuinely help here too, when used actively rather than passively. A weekly video call with family or a messaging group with old friends can meaningfully supplement in-person connection, particularly for those with mobility limitations. even though it is not a full substitute for it. It is worth acknowledging, too, that initiating contact can feel harder than it used to, particularly for anyone whose social circle has become smaller through loss or distance. Being the one to reach out first, even briefly, tends to matter more than waiting for an invitation. And research on reciprocity in friendship suggests most people are glad to be the ones reached out to. Pets are worth a brief mention in this context, too. While they do not fully replace human connection in the research, caring for an animal has been associated with modestly lower loneliness scores and a built-in daily routine of engagement, particularly for those living alone. If the idea of joining something new feels like a large first step, starting even smaller counts. A 5-minute conversation with a familiar neighbor, or calling one old friend this week specifically, rather than waiting for a larger opportunity to present itself. Quick reminder if you're finding this useful. Subscribing helps this channel keep making videos like it, and I do read the comments. And now, Habit 1. The one fewer than 1 in 8 adults over 75 maintain consistently, and which researchers at institutions like Johns Hopkins have pointed to as one of the more underused tools available to older adults without a prescription attached to it. Habit 1. Daily Purposeful Cognitive Challenge. Not crossword puzzles and not passive reading. Both have their place, but something more specific. The regular practice of learning something genuinely new. A skill, a language, an instrument, a form of creative expression that puts the brain into a state of productive difficulty. Here's why this one matters so much. With age, the brain tends to increasingly favor familiar, well-worn neural pathways, an efficient survival strategy, but one that can come at the cost of what researchers call cognitive reserve, the brain's buffer against age-related change. Research on aging populations, including long-running cohort studies out of the University of Edinburgh, has associated regular engagement in novel, challenging mental activity with slower measured rates of brain volume loss and better preserved processing speed and memory over time. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to form new connections, does decline somewhat with age, but research consistently shows it doesn't disappear. The brain retains a real capacity for structural change well into the 80s, given enough of the right kind of stimulus. Novel learning appears to be exactly that stimulus. Learning a new language in particular has been studied for its association with delayed onset of cognitive decline in some research, likely because it activates several brain regions simultaneously rather than just one. A practical approach. Choose one genuinely new skill every few months and spend 20 to 30 minutes a day actively engaged in learning it. The word actively matters. Watching someone else play an instrument isn't the same as sitting with one yourself and working through the difficulty. That productive struggle is where the benefit seems to live. Pairing this kind of mental challenge with regular omega-3 intake, DHA specifically, found in fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines, is worth knowing about too, since DHA is a core structural fat in brain cell membranes, and some research associates higher DHA levels with a better neurological response to learning. It is worth saying plainly that frustration is part of this, not a sign of doing it wrong. The discomfort of being a genuine beginner again, at anything, is precisely the kind of mental friction the research associates with building cognitive reserve. Ease and comfort, ironically, do far less for the brain than a bit of productive struggle. If a full new skill feels like too much of a commitment to start, smaller versions count too. Switching which hand you use for routine tasks, learning to cook a single new recipe each week from scratch, or working through a beginner language app for a few minutes daily are all genuine, accessible entry points. It also helps to pick something genuinely enjoyable rather than something chosen out of obligation. The cognitive benefit in the research is tied to sustained, voluntary engagement, and people are far more likely to sustain a new habit at any age when it is built around real curiosity rather than a sense of should. It is also worth noting that this habit tends to reinforce several of the others simultaneously. A cooking class builds social engagement and cognitive challenge at once. A walking-based birdwatching hobby combines movement, novelty, and often a social group, all in a single activity, which is part of why researchers in this space often recommend choosing overlapping habits rather than treating all 6 as entirely separate boxes to check. And if none of the traditional examples appeal, the underlying principle matters more than the specific activity. Any pursuit that is genuinely new, mildly difficult, and voluntarily chosen is doing the same essential work for the brain, whatever form it happens to take. Let's bring these together. Strategic hydration, resistance movement twice a week, a consistent sleep schedule, deliberately distributed protein, daily social engagement, and purposeful cognitive challenge. None of these require expensive equipment or a complete lifestyle overhaul. What the research broadly agrees on is this: the period after 75 is too often treated like a countdown rather than a continuation. The evidence doesn't support that framing. The body and mind at 75, 80, and 85 retain a real, if more effortful, capacity for resilience. None of these habits are about turning back the clock. They're about making full use of the time the clock still has, carrying your own groceries, remembering the names that matter to you, showing up for the people and activities that make ordinary days feel worth having. One honest note before we close. I'm David Morgan, an AI-generated health educator, not a licensed physician, geriatrician, or medical professional. Everything in this video is general source-checked information, not personal medical advice. If you're managing a specific health condition, take medication, or are considering a significant change to your diet or exercise routine, please loop in your own doctor or a geriatric specialist first. They know your specific situation in a way no video can. Now, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Leave your age in the comments and tell me which of these 6 habits you already feel solid on and which one you're going to work on next. I read every comment. Next time, we'll look at something a lot of you have asked about: what the research actually says about supplements after 70, and which ones are worth the money versus which ones mostly aren't. I'll see you there.